Western idea of going, separating from origin, in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and going out on this heroic journey. It's sometimes associated with colonialism, even, but then there is this return. But you're using it in a very specific way. So I want to give you an opportunity to say a little bit more about that. Then we'll go to Lewis to see what he feels about it. So,
I think that Joseph Campbell kind of developed it off of concepts of anthropologists, again, who are Westerners, but studying other cultures like Victor Turner, I forget who it was before Victor Turner, the Dutch guy who wrote about the rites of passage, I think. So they are ideas, Western ideas, but in a way it's trying to make sense. And I think what Campbell was trying to do was find the unitary story beneath all stories. And we could say, well, that's a modernist, universalist perspective, and that it's colonizing because it's incorporating and absorbing the stories of the world through a Western framework. But in working with Joseph Rael and in trying to make sense of how you go from a state that you're in into a state of suffering, and then to learn from that suffering and come back into a state through transformation and to return back. I mean, that also fits in a way with like what Joseph talks about with intentional suffering, that you're going to have suffering in your life one way or another. If through kind of ritual and ceremony, you take on some of that suffering willingly, then it's easier to grow from it rather than to suffer it as a victim. But I see that just that larger kind of human experience of how do we grow from suffering is one that we could characterize as a form of initiation. And then one of the ways that we talk about initiation in Western society, what Joseph Campbell did was he said, we've lost all our rituals, so I'm going to tell you a story that can be our new ritual. And so in Western society, we can say, oh my gosh, I'm going through a real hero's journey with this. You won't believe what my boss did. Or, I've got to quit my job. Or, I've got a parent who's dying and I'm going through this hero's journey now. So those are some of my thoughts. But I am always, it's a very good question, and I'm not always comfortable with my answers. So I'd be curious to hear Lewis's perspective.
Okay, I want to come back to Lewis, and you can address both this idea about whether the hero's journey works as a story for in your experience with Native Americans, or for yourself. And then also, if you want to add, I want to get into the heart of the conversation today about how we balance these different ways of knowing, because indigenous ways of knowing seem to be much more about radical interconnection, community, healing through a balancing with all our relations. And the Western way of knowing, or the Western way of medicine, seems to be much more about healing within one physical body and trying to trace that linear causality. So I turn it to you, Lewis.
I think the hero's journey is a metaphor for human adaptation. So, you're in a state of homeostasis. Everything is pretty groovy, things are trucking along, and something comes along to perturb the system. So there's an irritation, there's a disturbance, and you're forced to figure out a new level of adaptation. And whether the journey is internal or external, you have to find a new homeostasis. And we could talk about that as healing, or as adaptation, or as evolution, or, there's lots of ways to talk about it. But it's something that all biological and social systems do. So it's, it's not limited to Greeks, Romans, or other similar characters. And certainly in Indigenous stories, there's lots of heroic journeys. There's a really fun story about I think it's Wolverine. It's a Maine story. Wolverine realizes that he's living with his parents and there's no one else around. And all of these Maine stories start off once upon a time in the middle of the forest. And so there they are in the middle of the forest. And his mother says, well, you need to go find a wife. And so he sets out on a journey to find a wife. He runs into Glooskap. Glooskap is the cultural hero of Maine. And Glooskap gives him some things to do. And when he does them, he's rewarded with the advice he needs to get through the danger on the journey to the place where he can find a wife. And, there's so much more to this story than that. But eventually, he saves the day, is rewarded with a wife, comes back home, and lives happily for at least another couple days.
Excelente. What about in your medical practice? How have you been able to navigate pushback from colleagues or the general public when you're proposing complementary ways of healing? I'm not sure I like the word alternative, but more complementary ways of healing for your patients. How have you been able to navigate that? And I ask you, Louis, first.
I haven't always. Once upon a time, I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and I was the medical director of the Center for Complementary Medicine. And we were thriving, and the approach that we took was to find out which patients no one wanted to see. And then we went around to the specialty practices, and we said, we'd like to get referrals for the patients that you don't want to see. And so who were, fibromyalgia, chronic, you can imagine the kind of diagnoses we were getting. And everyone was happy because they left the specialists alone and they were getting better. And this was going on for 4 years. And then the dean changed. And the new dean, it was interesting because the new dean had never seen a patient. He'd spent his whole career in virology. And he decided to shut us down because we weren't, as he said, evidence-based. And the whole community came out to support us. The medical staff at the hospital, they said, you can't get rid of these guys. They take care of the people we don't want to see.
Oh, that's a good story.
But he shut us down anyway, and so I had to move on. But, and he turned it into a pain block clinic with anesthesiologists. So sometimes you get the bear and sometimes the bear gets you.
David, or Dave, I know you want to, in your book with Joseph Rael, you explored so many things. I think that book is, as I was mentioning to you, is really 10 books in one. And one of the things you explored was about how what Joseph would call wa ma chi, breath, matter, movement, and you explored how healing processes are all in motion all the time. So how do you even talk to other colleagues if you have to use nouns and diagnosis, prognosis, and have to pin everything down within that language? How can you express what is underneath there, what you're seeking?
Yeah, I think, sometimes what I'll do is I'll appeal back to the ancient kind of roots of medicine as having the art and science of medicine. And I think what's happened now is we've really just focused on supercharging the science of medicine, and we often forget the art of medicine. So, what Lewis ran into, this idea of evidence-based medicine, is really kind of a new dogma that excludes anything that doesn't fit within a box. And so I try and come up to play with these terms even, and to think about, in addition to evidence-based medicine, we need human-based medicine that just looks at the realities of what it is to be human, or care-based medicine. How can we develop medicine that's based on caring and compassion, as well as doing the evidence-based medicine? And there's a few different frameworks, like Joseph Rael will talk about ordinary reality and non-ordinary reality. And in a way, with a vision, you leave ordinary reality, you go into non-ordinary reality. It changes your reality in some way, and then your journey back is into trying to bring that vision back into ordinary reality, so that it transforms yourself and it brings life into yourself as well as the culture. Darwin talked about lumpers and splitters. Naturalists who would look at two sparrows, for instance, say those are two different species because they're different. And someone else would talk about those are the same species because they're similar. And Lewis talks about two-eyed seeing too, So I think that's it. There's a joke that I heard on the radio one time that's there's two kinds of people. The kind of people who think there's two kinds of people, and all the rest. So I think it's almost that larger paradigm that you're trying to struggle with, of whether people are trying to split things out and divide things out, and this has evidence and that doesn't have evidence. And then there's all the people who are like, no, let's bring it all together. It all kind of fits together. And, bring the science and the evidence, but, let's invite somebody else to the party too.
Lewis, can you please add?
Yeah, I think there's a whole politics of evidence that those in power decide what is evidence and how is evidence produced. And typically it's excluded indigenous knowledge, which is the whole point of two-eyed seeing, or Edo-Optimunk in the Mi'kmaq language. And, it's become so narrow that those in power in medicine have taken a methodology which is good for comparing two drugs, and have tried to apply it to everything, and to the exclusion of stories, to the exclusion of qualitative research, and it's something that I think we have to fight against, because it results in overtreatment. And there's some fairly conventional epidemiologists now who have become quite critical of everything being based on the randomized controlled trial, because what happens is the sickest people control the trial results, and you end up with treating 80% of the people when only 20% need the treatment. And just a quick example, lest we get on down a rabbit hole that I could go on forever about.